Okay, so welcome everybody to the second uh, Fratelli Tutti discussion, right? This will be chapters 3 and 4 that I'll be covering, and the structure will be just like it was last time. I'll do a short 15, 20-minute presentation, and then we'll go around, have everybody share a little bit about their favorite parts, and then we'll have an open discussion to conclude it. And so I'll just jump right in. The first thing I want to talk about is chapter 3, right? Envisaging and engendering an open world. Um, so, what he starts off with in chapter 3, again, it's the same structure as last time. Everything that's in these blue boxes is Pope Francis' direct quote, right? So, everything in these boxes is exactly what he wrote. Anything I think, or if I'm adding additional things, it'll come up above my head in a little bubble thing. Okay. So for chapter 3, Pope Francis says, no one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love. So this whole chapter, what he's trying to do is stress the point that we are made for relationships. It's relating to others that brings the beauty out of life. Okay. And he splits it into 6 different sections. He talks about first moving beyond ourselves and how love has to, if it's growing, if it's developing, if we're maturing in our love, it becomes progressively more and more and more open and more embracing of everybody. Okay. And he tries to push us to move to a world beyond associates, right? We have Facebook friends, 1,000 friends, but that's not fraternity. That's just a bunch of associates we have. He says a universal love also promotes persons. Now, this is really insightful. We'll talk a little more about it when we get there. But one of the greatest gifts that Christianity has given the world, in my opinion, is the idea of a person and what a person is. It was only through all the working out and the theological struggle and the philosophical precision that we developed this idea of a person in order to explain what the Trinity was. And it's an amazing gift, and it's just ubiquitous. Everybody in the whole world and pretty much every language has an idea of what person is and personhood. And that's a beautiful gift that Christianity gave to the world. So Pope Francis talks a little bit about that, how universal love promotes persons and it promotes the moral good. And then he has this really big part where it's the big ideas, right? He said he wanted this encyclical to promote conversation among people. And he just tries to re-envisage the whole social role of property. And he has some pretty big claims that are pretty exciting. But let's move on. Okay. So the first part, moving beyond ourselves. Pope Francis says authentic and mature love and true friendship can only take root in hearts open to growth through relationships with others. And here's where he pulls St. Thomas Aquinas, our wonderful Dominican hero, about the unique value of love and how it's so important. So two little parts he brings St. Thomas in. First, he says, St. Thomas says, the temperance of a greedy person is in no way virtuous because virtues all come together kind of as a package. Okay. You can't just be virtuous in one area if you're horribly sinful in all these other areas. They're all underpinned with the virtue of charity, with the virtue of love that gives all the virtues a foundation. And then this little second point here, St. Thomas Aquinas sought to describe the love made possible by God's grace as a movement outwards towards another, right? Whereby we consider the beloved as somehow united to ourselves. Yes. Okay, here we go. The quote from Aristotle that I wanted earlier was that loving seems to be the characteristic virtue of friends, right? So when you're talking about friends, the virtue that characterizes real friendship is the love between the two friends. And St. Catherine of Siena, in her dialogue, this is one of my favorite parts of her dialogue. She makes this super bold claim that says, your neighbors are the channel through which all of your virtues are tested and come to birth. So sometimes we can get in this idea that I need to become a virtuous person by working by myself on my flaws and getting better and better at what I do as a person. But that's not at all what St. Catherine of Siena was talking about or what Aristotle was talking about. The way we become virtuous, become better people, is through our neighbors, through our relationships with our neighbors. That's when our virtues are tested. That's where our virtues are born. And that's what builds society, is those relationships. The relationships help us become virtuous. Okay. Okay. And now this section, I talked a little bit about this section, but this idea of social friendship that Aristotle is introducing here really brought to mind a section in Aristotle's Ethics where he talks about justice. First, he does this big treatment of justice in book 6. Then he has a little diversion in book 7 before he gets back to friendship in book 8 again. And what Aristotle does at the beginning of book 8 is he compares friendship and justice. Okay. And Aristotle says this quote: "The truest form of justice is thought to be a friendly quality." Okay. And that's what I think Pope Francis is talking about here with his idea of social friendship. It's social friendship. I think what Pope Francis is saying is that this is the truest form of justice. So when we're talking about a just society, Pope Francis's goal is this idea of social friendship. At least that's how I read it. Okay, let's move on. A world beyond associates. Here he entitles the section Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity. And now when I hear that, I think of France, right? Because in France, you hear liberty, equality, fraternity. The very first time that those three words were brought together was during the French Revolution. Robespierre introduced them as a motto, but it got voted down and it wasn't officially accepted as a motto during the French Revolution. It didn't come in until about 150 years later that they made it an official motto. And I'm not sure if Pope Francis is intentionally making a connection to that or not. He doesn't bring up the French Revolution or anything like that in this little section, but what he does talk about here is how fraternity needs to be the foundation of liberty and equality. Okay. They're ordered liberty, equality, fraternity, but fraternity has to be the source, the base, the origin, the foundation of the other two, because fraternity is born not only of a climate of respect for individual liberties or of a certain administratively guaranteed equality. Fraternity necessarily calls for something greater, which enhances freedom and equality. So equality and freedom, I mean, if we think back to what he said in the second chapter, right? He said these words just get bandied about so much, they just kind of become these empty husks that people use on both sides of the argument. What Pope Francis is saying here is that we need to get back and understand fraternity and what true friendship and social friendship is, because that relationship of love between people enhances freedom and equality. It's like what gives meaning and substance to a true equality and a true freedom. Okay. And then Pope Francis goes on here, said, nor is equality achieved by an abstract proclamation that all men and women are equal. Instead, equality is the result of the conscious and careful cultivation of fraternity. So this again, he's doing so many big things in this encyclical because he's just trying to flip the way we look at everything. Normally we think, okay, we got to start with everybody equal and everybody free. And he's saying, no, those are almost like the flowers that bloom from fraternity, right? It's this friendship, this love, these relationships that we build, it blossoms into an authentic, true, and full freedom and true equality, when you respect people for who they are and what they are. And then he says right here at the end, individualism does not make us more free, more equal, or more fraternal, right? And so much of our society is based on this individualism now. And if you want to boil down this whole section, it's like individualism is bad. It doesn't make us free or equal or fraternal. Okay. We got to think more as a family is what he's doing. Okay. Next section is about a universal love that promotes persons. Social friendship and like social friendship, remember that's how I kind of understand Pope Francis's catchphrase for like the highest form of justice. And universal fraternity necessarily call for an acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere. And a truly human and fraternal society will be capable of ensuring in an efficient and stable way that each of its members is accompanied at every stage of life. Implanted deep within us is the call to transcend ourselves through an encounter with others. Now, this harkens back a little bit to his quotes from St. Thomas Aquinas, how love pulls us out of ourselves, right? And that's the implanted deep within us call to transcend ourselves through an encounter with others. Love draws us out of ourselves. It helps us grow and mature and become large-souled, great-souled individuals. Mhm. Okay. Now, individual rights versus the common good. This this whole slide is just from one paragraph of the encyclical, paragraph 111. Now, today there's a tendency, he says, to claim ever broader individual, Pope Francis says, I'm tempted to say individualistic rights. And underlying this is a conception of the human person as detached from all social and anthropological context, as if the person were a monad, increasingly unconcerned with others. So he's saying our overemphasis on the individual and isolating the individual, it's disconnecting us from other people, right? And unless the rights of each individual are ordered to the greater good, those rights will end up being considered limitless and consequently will become a source of conflict and violence, right? Because if we're just thinking about a person in isolation, it's kind of like, I don't know, like a circle or like a point, right? Without any relationships to understand how the rights are connected to duties, um, you can't see a limit to it, right? You're understanding rights not as relation, and rights always have to deal with a relationship. Um, this word Pope Francis uses here, the monad, as if the person were a monad. Where that comes from, that's a philosophical term introduced by Leibniz. He was a philosopher around the 17th century. He invented calculus. So, for all of you that loved math, or if you didn't, he's the person you can curse. Leibniz and Newton invented calculus at the same time. And Leibniz came up with this philosophical system as an attempt to answer Descartes. Descartes had this idea of a dualistic philosophy where there's soul and body and they're completely separate substances. Like anything body is just extension and a soul is a thinking substance. There's this dualism where they're constantly fighting, right? Leibniz introduced monads as the only true substances, but it's kind of a mistake because he thinks of monads as these undivided points of unity in a sense. And I think that's why Pope Francis is bringing in his philosophical terminology here, because I remember Leibniz talks about like windowless monads, like these monads that have absolutely no connection or relation to anything else. And so I think that's what Pope Francis is referring to with his bringing in monads here. We can't be that isolated, okay? We can't be that isolated. Okay, promoting the moral good, the next little section of chapter 3. This is an attitude that wills the good of others. It bespeaks a yearning for goodness, an inclination towards all that is fine and excellent, a desire to fill the lives of others with what is beautiful, sublime, and edifying. Oh, That just brings to mind one of my favorite verses from the Bible, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, right? Whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, gracious, if there's any excellence, and if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. It sounds exactly like what Pope Francis is talking about here. This is an attitude that wills the good of others. And it's an attitude that needs to be implanted deep within our psyche, because the way we habitually think about things, the way we relate to things, it kind of overflows out of the abundance of what's on the inside of us, right? And this is an attitude that wills the good of others. If we're thinking about the true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, gracious, excellent things worthy of praise, it's an attitude that wills the good because you're thinking about that and you want that good for other people. And then Pope Francis talks about the value of solidarity. Solidarity finds concrete expression in service, which can take a variety of forms in an effort to care for others. But solidarity finds concrete expression in service. Now, that's worth a whole slide in itself. Let's talk about solidarity. This is just paragraph 116 of the encyclical, but the way he breaks down solidarity here is so insightful. Solidarity means much more than just engaging in sporadic acts of charity, right? If we go back, if solidarity finds concrete expression in service, Pope Francis says it's not just sporadic acts of service. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It means that combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land, housing, the denial of social and labor rights, we fight against the structural causes of those things. It means confronting the destructive effects of an empire of money. And solidarity, understood in its most profound meaning, Pope Francis says, is a way of making history. Again, this encyclical is like a big idea encyclical, right? It's pretty amazing. It brings to mind Pope St. John Paul II, and he talked a lot about solidarity too. And his on social concern, right? This is how Pope John Paul II talked about solidarity as a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. Yeah, solidarity is very important. Okay, now let's talk about, this is the very last part of chapter 3, re-envisioning the social role of property. Now, this is also another big thing here. The principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. Wow. Right, that's a huge claim, saying that the principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the ethical and social order. And he splits this into two separate sections here, the rights without borders and then the rights of peoples. When he's talking about the rights of borders, no one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth. And the rights of peoples, a territory's goods must not be denied to a needy person coming from elsewhere. Now that's key. Okay, this word here, needy, that's the key phrase that makes this work. And what, Pope Francis says, we are really speaking about a new network of international relations. Now, his big claim here that this principle is the foundation, we can go right back to St. Thomas Aquinas. In his Summa Theologiae, Secunda Secundae, question 66, article 7, it's his question on stealing and on theft. St. Thomas says, direct, in cases of need, all things are common property, so that there would seem to be no sin in taking another's property, for need has made it common. Like, this is a principle. It seems very strange to us because of, whole Western society, right? The foundation of our Western democracy is so much of it's just predicated on this idea of private property as this inalienable right. But throughout the tradition of the church, we understand created goods, the created world as a common gift given to us by God, right? So if somebody is in need, if they're starving and they need food, it's not a sin for them to steal it to stay alive. That blew my mind when I first read that in St. Thomas. I'm like, what? Because the way we're raised in our culture in the United States is private property, and stealing's like the worst thing that could ever happen. But no, no, that's not it. God created the earth as a gift for all of us, right? So in cases of need, all things are common property. Um, okay, let's move on. I'm taking up more time than I should again. Chapter 4 is a lot shorter, though. It's just a few pages. I only got a couple slides on it. So, chapter 4, Pope Francis talks about a heart open to the whole world. And he brings up numerous related issues emerge that force us to see things in a new light and develop new responses. So, he talks about borders and their limits, talks about reciprocal gifts, how to exchange gratuitous openness to others, and the tension between local and universal, and how both of them need to stay connected. So borders and their limits. Ideally, now this is key too, especially considering what we just covered, right? But Pope Francis begins this section by saying, ideally, unnecessary migration ought to be avoided. This entails creating in countries of origin the conditions needed for a dignified life and integral development. But at the same time, our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized by 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. And then he makes the claim that we should reject the discriminatory use of the term minorities, because just using that term, he says, is discriminatory. If we're all thinking of each other as brothers and sisters, we can't speak of people as minorities and majorities. We're just one family. Okay, reciprocal gifts. This is where he talks about how migrants bring an opportunity for enrichment and the integral human development of all, right? So we have a fruitful exchange in order to attain a global order, which can increase and give direction to international cooperation for the development of all peoples in solidarity. And only a social and political culture that readily and gratuitously welcomes others will have a future. Otherwise, it's just going to fade out of existence if it's not welcoming and open and growing. Okay, local and universal. This is the last slide here. Universal fraternity and social friendship are thus 2 inseparable and equally vital poles in every society. So this universal fraternity and this social friendship, highest form of justice, are 2 inseparable poles, right? Because you got the local flavor. The common good requires that we protect and love our own native land. So we have to maintain our culture, our native land. We have to grow in love for it and protect it. But there also has to be that universal horizon, that universal fraternity. To attain fulfillment in life, we need others. And he says, start with our own region. Love for one's neighbor. That's the first indispensable step towards attaining a healthy universal integration. Right? That echoes right back to, right, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay.